Hi, welcome to the session by RouteFabric, and in today's session we're going to be going over methods in Java. Alright, so the plan for today is first we're going to discuss the general idea of functions in programming, and then we're going to talk about how Java handles methods specifically, and then we're going to discuss how we can write methods in Java, and then we're just going to write a simple program to test the waters with methods. All right, so functions in programming. So what exactly are functions? So basically a function is a part of our code that can do something, some operation, or it can change data in some way, that kind of thing. So in programming, a function is a module that can be executed. So functions can do a lot of different things. We can have functions that manipulate data or they create their own data, or we can have functions that can simply perform some task without manipulating any data. So for example, we can print to the screen, or if we're doing a graphical application, we can draw a window, that kind of thing. So those kind of functions aren't necessarily creating new data or changing the data we give them in any way. They're just performing some task for us. So functions are extremely powerful in programming as it allows us to perform many operations, the same operation many times, I should say, with the exact same code. So we can continuously call functions and it'll do whatever that function does, and we can do this over and over again. So we don't have to copy that code. So let's say we have a function that changes a character in a string to uppercase or something like that. We can call that function over and over again for any amount of strings, any amount of characters, and we won't have to rewrite any of that code. We just have to call that specific function. So functions really allow us to scale our project up as each function can be independent and modular. A great example of this is system.out.print. So we've already used this function a bunch of times, very commonly used. But if you think about it, this function was only written once, and then we just call it whenever we need it. And this function, system.out.print, is used in countless different Java projects, in probably thousands of different projects, over an endless amount of use cases. So you can use this for, so many different scenarios. So this is a great example of how a function allows us to scale our project up because this code is only written once, but then it's executed an infinite number of times. All right, so composition of a function. So before we can write functions in Java, first we need to understand what a function in programming is composed of. So there's a couple of different parts to a function. So first off, a function should have a name, and this is used to identify the function, and the name should accurately describe what the function does in that context. So let's say I have, for example, a function that changes a character to uppercase in a string. I could call that function toUppercase. Or if it was to change the whole string to all be uppercase, I could call it, string to uppercase, something like that. Some name that will allow us to, be able to tell what the function does pretty easily. And also keep in mind the name of the function should only really make sense in its context. So for example, print might seem like a vague name at first. When you see print, you're thinking, okay, print where, print what does that do? But if we think about it in the context of system.out, which we know is the out stream to the console, to the JVM console, then we can tell that when we see system.out.print, what we're really seeing there is, okay, in the system out stream to the console, print something to the console. So that's just something to keep in mind, that when you're naming your functions, they don't necessarily have to be extremely specific if the class they exist in kind of gives some context for what they do. Functions can also have parameters. So parameters describe what information is passed into a function for it to use. So whenever we call a function and if we want to give it some information for that function to use, then we have to pass that in with a parameter. The actual data itself that you pass in is called an argument. This is just a little note, a semantic note, just so you know the terminology. And we will discuss passing arguments in detail in a bit once we get to functions in Java. And then lastly, a function has a return value. So a return value is data being handed back by the function. So if we think of something like a math function and we have like y equals x squared, our function we can think of as x squared. X is the parameter, Well, the return value is going to be y because our function x squared is going to return something. So we put in 5, it's going to return 25. We put in 10, it's going to return 100. So return value is something being handed back by the function. And keep in mind, return values don't always have to be used. So we can use a function just to perform some operation, and then we can completely ignore the return value. Let's say the function returns back an integer. We can just simply not store that integer in a variable and then it's lost. It's not used in any way. Or we can even specify to not return anything if a return isn't necessary. Like for example, something like system.out.print, you don't really need a return there because you're just printing to the screen. You're just printing to the console. You don't need it to return anything. All right, so passing arguments. So data can be passed into a function with function parameters. So this is very useful because this allows outside data to be used by a function. So let's look at the example, system.out.print, and then a string with hello. So what are we actually passing here? So we're passing a string with hello, kind of, and we'll talk more about specifically passing arguments in Java in a bit, because there is a little bit more to it than that. When we pass hello, we're not actually passing a string object. I'll explain it in a little bit. So, but generally in programming as a whole, there are two ways to pass arguments. So we can pass an argument by value, which means we pass the actual value associated with a variable. So thereby we copy it. So let's say, for example, we have a function and it takes in an integer. When we pass in an integer, we're not actually passing in that specific integer variable that is located in our code. What we're passing in is the value of that integer. So we're passing in 5, or passing in 25, that kind of thing. But we can also have something called pass by reference, in which we do actually pass in the actual location of memory. So when we do this, the actual variable that we pass in will be altered, not some copy of it. Unless, of course, we make a copy within the function, then we won't alter the variable. But when we pass in by reference, this means that the actual variable will be edited. So if we go back to like the x squared example, if we were to pass by value, and we were to write in, x squared, and we put in 5, and we print the value of x, if it's passed by value, the value of x will still be 5, even though we called x squared. But now if we pass by reference, and then we were to print out the value of x, you'll see it's actually going to be 25 now because we changed that actual value, the actual data there. We didn't just work with a copy of the value. All right, so we can construct functions in Java. So functions that are written within a class are sometimes referred to as a method. So this is just a semantic thing. Generally, if a function is within a class, we call that a method. They're really both the same thing. It's just that methods are specifically for a class. So don't get too caught up on the terminology there. In Java, all code is within classes. So we've already touched on this. And it's obvious when you're creating your code, you cannot write any code outside of a class. You can do imports and that kind of thing, but the actual code itself has to be in the class. So therefore, in Java, all functions are methods. So because of this, you'll hear them referred to by either name. So you hear some people call them functions, some people call them methods. More often people call them methods because that's just a little bit more accurate. But either or is perfectly fine. So since our methods must be within a class, we can specify static, the static keyword, to allow us to execute a method without creating an object. So this will be covered more in depth when we talk about object-oriented programming. All you need to know for now is that when we create a method within a class, in order to use that method, we have to create an object, and we don't always want to do that. So we can specify static to say, hey, you can call this method without an object. You don't have to create an object. One example is main. Think about it. Main is a static method because when we go to main, we don't actually create a an object or anything to run main. It just runs main. It goes straight to main. So that's why you'll see public static void main. We can also specify access modifiers for our function. So that's public, private, protected. We're not going to get into this for now because it's not really relevant right now, but just kind of keep that in mind if you see that. All right, so passing in parameters in Java. So in Java, all arguments are passed by value. This is really important to realize. There is no such thing by passing by reference in Java. This is because, again, we don't have direct access to memory in Java. Therefore, it's technically impossible to pass by reference because we can't pass something like, say, a pointer or a reference because we cannot specify those in Java. We don't have access to the memory. So you might be thinking, well, that's kind of strange because doesn't this mean that all our functions can't edit the actual data we send it? So doesn't that create a big limitation on our functions? And technically, yes, but it's important to remember that our objects variables, our objects that we create, are actually, or I should say, our object variables are actually references. They're just a reference type to some object on the heap. And so since these objects on the heap have an undefined lifespan, those can be edited within methods, and the actual object will change if the object is mutable, of course, if you can change it. So this means that, basically what this means, I'll explain it, is that primitive types cannot be changed when passed into a function because when we pass in a reference type, that reference is, or I'm sorry, whenever we pass in a primitive type, it's going to always be passed by value, and so we can't change the actual memory itself. But when we pass in a reference type, let's say we create a string called name, and we pass in name, the reference is copied. But so when the reference is copied, we really just get two references to the exact same object. So really, we're not copying any objects there, and that's why we can directly edit objects within a method because we'll pass in a reference, and then even though that reference is copied, they're both going to be referencing the same object, so we can edit it. Don't worry, this will be less confusing when we see it in action. So once we actually get coding, this will hopefully get cleared up. I know it sounds kind of confusing for now. So in Java, return values must be specified a type in the method declaration or definition. So what this means is whenever we write a function in Java, we need to specify what type we're returning always. We can't just return anything. Java's not going to check that for us, so we have to specify, hey, we're returning this specific type. If we choose not to return any value, for example, we have something like a print method, something that just prints something to the screen, and we don't need to return anything. We can specify return type of void, and really all that means is it's not going to return anything. We don't have to include any return statements. So it's important to note that when return is called in our method, so whenever we write return within our method will stop executing immediately as soon as it sees that return statement, and it'll return control as well as that value we're returning to whatever method, to whatever call that method, I should say. So that's important to note. Your method isn't always going to go all the way to the end of the parentheses. If you have returns higher up and you hit one of those returns, it's going to return immediately after it sees that. So that's important to keep in mind, and that's also important to keep in mind if you're checking for invalid values or that kind of thing. Maybe you'd want an early return, that kind of thing, so you don't execute based on wrong values or something like that. So this is something to keep in mind. So constructing a method in Java, first we have to keep in mind that methods cannot be defined within other methods in Java. So this means that, for example, we can't write a method within main, as main is also a method. So this just means that if we have a method, we can't write another method within it. We can, though, obviously, write methods within classes or write methods within classes that are within other classes. Anything like that is perfectly fine. So methods are indicated with the following syntax. So first we have the return type. So this would be something like int, char, string, whatever. And then we have our function name. You can call this anything, assuming there's not already another function with the same name, or it's like an illegal name, like if you're to put a number here, that might not necessarily work. And then we have our parameters, and before each parameter, we must specify the type. So again, int, char, some object or class we created, that kind of thing. And you can specify how many parameters you want to take in, and you want to separate them by commas, and then we have curly braces, and our code goes within there. So let's look at the following method. So we have a method here, and let's just break it down. Let's break down what exactly is going on here. So what is the return type of this method? Well, we said the return type is going to be right in front of the function name. So it appears that this function is returning an integer, an int type. And the name of this function is going to be called greater than. So by the name, we can kind of guess, okay, this is going to do something, finding out which number is greater than another. So this is why naming your function a relevant name is important. And you'll see it's going to take in two numbers, two integers here. So it's going to take an integer number 1 and an integer number 2. And then it's going to do, so it's going to say if num1 is greater than num2, it's going to return num1. Otherwise, else we're going to return num2. So what does this really mean? So we're saying we're going to pass it two numbers, doesn't matter which order the numbers are in, and this is always going to return whichever one is greater. So that's how this one's going to work, or greater than or equal to in this case. So that's how this function works right here. You'll notice we have multiple return statements. That's perfectly fine. That means that if we get over here and this condition is true, I should say, then this is going to return right here. So we're not even going to go to this else statement. We're not even going to consider anything else in this function. We're going to return right there. All right, perfect. So we also need to talk about scope within methods. This is actually very important to keep in mind when we're writing methods in Java. So methods in Java have a limited scope. So what does this mean? This means that we can only access variables within the local scope of that method. So any variables declared within that method, we can access. Any variables passed in to that method, we can access. And any variables within the local scope, like in the class that method exists in, we can access. So we can only see variables passed in or creating in the method or available in the class. That's what the variables we can see. So because methods are created on the stack and then destroyed once done executing, all variables within the method are destroyed as well. So this is just a memory management thing to keep in mind. If we declare a variable within a method, that method is going to get deleted. Basically, it's going to get destroyed as soon as it gets to the end of the method or a return is encountered. So when that happens, it's going to be popped off the stack and your method's gone. And that means all the variables that you declared within there are gone. So the only thing you'd have at that point is your return. If you returned a value, you'll have that because that will go to the method that called it underneath it in the stack. And if you also change some objects on the heap, that will remain changed because objects on the heap don't get destroyed when a method is popped off the stack. Those will stay there because they have an undefined lifespan. So keep in mind, objects will not be destroyed necessarily. We can end up destroying objects in our method. If we were to destroy a reference to it, we could do something like that. But the objects will be kept alive as long as a reference exists. So as long as there's a reference to an object somewhere, and that reference is still valid, it's still within scope and everything, then it's the object is going to continue to exist. All right, so let's make a program. So we will be creating a simple bank program utilizing methods. So we'll prompt the user for his name as well as how much he wants to withdraw, and then we will just we'll say if he wants to withdraw more than his balance, then we will deny his withdrawal, and the program should run continuously. So this is a pretty simple program. We're just going to make sure we use plenty of methods, and we are actually going to continue this in the next video. So I hope this lesson was informative. If you would like to learn more about methods in Java, you can check out our lessons at RouteFabric.com. Thank you.